This week on Act Out, updates on badass organizers, activists, and whistleblowers. Next, what we really need in order to stop the empire and why we can't just lean on letters from the UN. War fever is high and the propaganda machine is working overtime. Next, water woes in the world's largest firestorm, and what this has to do with an indigenous fight in Canada. Finally, Sunrise El Paso sits down to talk corporate takeovers of public utilities. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. An orange flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. To start off the new year here, I want to dive into some news about badass folks that are taking their fights to court and on tour. First up, Fang Collective co-founder Sherry Andre's trial began on Tuesday, January 7th, where they faced jail time for their participation in an action at the Bristol County House of Corrections. This action was held in solidarity with people in ICE detention who launched a hunger strike in order to demand better conditions at the facility. As many activists around the country, Sherry is being targeted for taking a stand against injustice and the rise of fascism in this country. For more info on the trial and how to connect and support, visit shutdownicenow.org. Also, a quick update here on the embassy protectors, the folks who were illegally arrested last spring for holding space against U.S. imperialism at the Venezuelan embassy here in Washington, D.C. The trial against them continues with a pretrial hearing this week and another court date on February 11th. In that time, they're taking their story on the road to raise awareness not just for their cases, but for the larger reality of the U.S. empire's war against Venezuela. They'll be in Florida, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Philly. To get more details and connect, visit defendembassyprotectors.org. And on the subject of badass humans fighting the empire, this week Nils Melzer, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, published a letter to the U.S. government dated November 1st, 2019, condemning the incarceration of Chelsea Manning, calling such coercive confinement torture in violation of international law, and recommending her immediate release. He also recommends that any disproportionate fines levied against Chelsea be cancelled. And this comes after Melzer for the second time sounded the alarm that Julian Assange's life is at risk due to the torture that he is being subjected to at Belmarsh Prison in the UK. For his part, Assange has been unable to respond, or indeed even have access to the outside world in order to prepare for his own bullshit trial. Chelsea Manning, however, was at least able to respond to Melzer's letter, stating that nearly every other legal system in the world condemns coercive confinement, and long ago replaced secret grand juries with public hearings. I am thrilled to see the practice of coercive confinement called out for what it is: incompatible with international human rights standards. Regardless, even knowing I am very likely to stay in jail for an even longer time, I'm never backing down. Chelsea's bravery in the face of the full force of U.S. empire is incredible, and it's powerful. Not just for the more obvious reasons, but for the reason that it casts a dark shadow on the silence of entire nations who accept U.S. imperial violence as the status quo. Because here's the problem. It's great that the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture is calling out crimes against Assange and Manning, but ultimately, these letters won't produce results. Unfortunately, the UN can't force the US to do anything, just like Iraq can't force US troops out with a parliamentary vote. That doesn't mean that these letters or these votes are meaningless, not at all. They are a shining light of potential and resistance to the largest empire that the world has ever seen. Indeed, they are worth killing for. Shortly after the U.S. assassination of General Soleimani, Iraq's Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi told his parliament that Soleimani was in Baghdad at my invitation. He was scheduled to visit me and carried a letter with him from the Iranian leadership on how to de-escalate tensions with Saudi Arabia. Soleimani was murdered before he could deliver that letter. Now, to say that he was killed just for a letter would be hyperbolic, but it's not far-fetched to say that he was killed because of what that letter represents. It represents Soleimani's work in combating U.S. imperialism in the region. He made the U.S. look bad. He threatened the war profiteering, be it meeting with Moscow to convince them to intervene in Syria, supporting the Houthis in Yemen, or leading Iraq's grassroots military forces, the Popular Mobilization Unit, against Daesh. His work flew in the face of our continued aggression and our narrative that Iran is just evil. As journalist Rania Khalek wrote in a tweet, ISIS is a fascist death cult that sought to genocide Shias. The group was an existential threat to the region. Soleimani is viewed as a superhero for leading the fight against the Middle East version of Nazis. That's who Trump assassinated. And you only have to look at the funeral procession to see the truth in that statement. What Soleimani represented, what he did, threatened imperial hegemony, and we need to see a lot more of it. His death highlights the need for more signs of life in the passive corpses of status quo politics. The empire is flailing. How much more death and destruction before we take it down? How long, for instance, before Europe grows a fucking spine and collectively demands the US pull back its economic warfare on Iran and pull out of the Middle East altogether? Allies like these are accomplices to genocide worldwide, and that has to be made unacceptable. And this doesn't just rest at the feet of the mighty in the halls of parliaments, this rests on our shoulders, as children of the empire, as residents and citizens of those silent nations, of those passive accomplices. We saw this past weekend a surge in anti-war activism, and we need to keep it up and grow. As people of the world, to use a rather trite phrase, but it's true. As Iranian filmmaker Marjani Satrapi once said, we have much more in common with each other than we do with our respective governments. And in order to survive, we have to hold on to that solidarity and cultivate it. As Nathan J. Robinson recently wrote on a piece about war propaganda in Current Affairs, if you're going to understand the world clearly, you have to kill your nationalistic emotions. And remember, war fever thrives on emotion rather than thought. It's very easy to come up with superficially persuasive arguments that can justify just about anything. The job of an intelligent populace is to see whether those arguments can actually withstand scrutiny. We have to expel the notion that our borders define us, that our aggression makes us safe, and that our government and its media tell the truth. They don't. They won't. They have and will always prefer making a buck off bloodshed than sharing the bounty of peace and welfare. Keep that in mind and activate along the borderless lines of solidarity. And for more on Soleimani and the situation in the Middle East, check out this week's episode of my podcast with Lee Camp, Common Censored. At this point, it's no secret that Australia is on fire. Last week, Ceding Sovereignty posted this graphic so folks could get some perspective on the sheer magnitude of these fires. What's happening there right now is comparable to our entire country being on fire and then some. More than 12 million acres of land have burned. This is a catastrophe never seen before, made possible by progressive climate chaos. And there's no shortage of reports on the impact on plants and animals, the atrocious air quality, and what this means for global emissions. Something that I want to touch on briefly, though, is what this means for water. Because already back in November, New South Wales, the area of Australia that includes the capital of Sydney, was 6 months into an emergency warning regarding their stores of water. Thanks to drought and increased water use due to excessively hot summers there, Sydney's water supply was running dangerously low. Now, as fires continue to rage, Australian authorities are trying to protect the struggling water stores, which includes some 40 dams across the state. Not surprisingly, huge amounts of ash and burnt debris would pose a serious threat to these already low stores of water. This past Friday, New South Wales declared a state of emergency the last 7 days, and as of Sunday, roughly half of the fires in that region alone were still uncontained. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison has been, flaccid at best, both in terms of response and planning. Things are not going to get easier. water is going to become more scarce. 2019 was once again the hottest year on record, just like the year before that, and the year before that, and the year before that. Just as here in the US, where some 2 million people, especially indigenous, lack access to clean water, the people of Australia are staring down a reality that threatens the very basics of survival. And the connections here cannot be overlooked nor overestimated. Another post from Ceding Sovereignty this past weekend reminds us to remember that most of these Australian fires could have been prevented if we followed the advice from indigenous people. Think about the term traditional custodians of the land, and consider how indigenous people see themselves as carers of the land versus the way politicians see themselves as managers of financial portfolios, i.e., the land and other natural resources. There's never been a more important time for Australia to consider who leads them and what giving sovereignty to indigenous people would mean for future generations. The disempowerment and gross oppression of indigenous peoples around the world is inextricably tied to the oppression and torture of global ecosystems. If we are to find a way to the other side of this climate chaos, we must recognize this link and work to dismantle current paradigms on nature and our place in it. In this same vein, keep your eyes and ears open for news on the Wet'suwet'en Nation, who on January 4th issued eviction notices to the Coastal Gas Link pipeline up in Canada. We've covered this fight on our show before, and this week solidarity actions will be taking place as the fight to preserve land, air, water, and all natural life continues in the traditional homelands of the Wet'suwet'en people. For more, visit unistoten.camp. Finally, today we turn to El Paso, where community members are fighting a move by financial giant JPMorgan Chase to buy up the local electric utility. Miguel Escoto and Joseph Valenzuela, co-organizers with Sunrise El Paso, sit down with us to discuss details, JP's history of corporate malfeasance in the energy sector, and why fighting sales like this is vital to ensuring access for all. Take a look.
We can look at the history of JPMorgan Chase. For example, in 2013, they were fined the largest amount at that time of $410 million for their illegal price fixing scheme in the energy markets in California and Michigan. And if I'm not mistaken, there was an internal leak from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that got out to the New York Times, I believe. And it was looking to fine JPMorgan Chase $1 billion and pursue criminal charges against Blythe Masters, who was the global commodities chief of JPMorgan. She is essentially the architect of the credit default swap, which brought about the '08 world economic crisis. So once that leak got out, JPMorgan officials got very concerned, and they ended up settling for $410 million and not pursuing any charges against Blythe Masters, despite the fact that FERC officials said that she lied to them under oath. So we have a clear example there of some of the tactics that JPMorgan Chase has been involved in the electricity markets. And what we're talking about here is JPMorgan Chase trying to get their hands on a monopoly. This isn't a company that sells lawnmowers or sells beer. We're talking about a private equity fund whose fundamental job it is to take on an investment and maximize the return on that investment in a short amount of time, because these are short-term investments that private equity funds are involved in. So again, we have to ask ourselves as a community in El Paso whether we want our electric company in the hands of the world's sixth largest bank, and not only in the hands of the world's sixth largest bank, but within the construct of a private equity fund. I mean, as a community, we should be able to have our say in how we want our electric company to run, where we're going to get our sources of power from. And once it gets into the hands of JPMorgan and this private equity fund, we're going to lose that right.
Yeah, and as Joseph mentioned, there's a whole host of financial injustices that are going on, but this also has to be viewed through the lens of the climate crisis, right? JPMorgan, according to research by Rainforest Action Network, is the top financier of destructive fossil fuel infrastructure projects in the world. They've financed more than $75 billion in projects such as the tar sand exploitation in Canada, Arctic oil drilling, and including the Permian Basin fracking region. So that leads us to the second point as to why we should oppose this deal on climate action reasons, is because the El Paso Electric Company right now has service territory in the Permian Basin, which is West Texas and East New Mexico. And this region is one of the most fracked regions in the world.
And with that, like, I also wanted to ask, with regards to that, talk about what makes up the bulk of El Paso Electric's energy portfolio right now. Is it a lot of the fracked gas? Are there any renewables? Like, how would that possibly change, do you think?
And so one of the facts that we keep trying to put out is that according to the World Meteorological Organization, El Paso is the 10th sunniest city in the world, yet less than 3% of our electricity comes from the sun. 49% comes from a nuclear power plant in the Palo Verde nuclear power plant in Arizona, and 37% comes from natural gas sources.
They are a for-profit organization, and sometimes, most of the times, these incentives directly conflict with our need to transition to renewable energy, right? So take, for example, rooftop solar. For a private company, it makes most sense for them to have as much paying customers as possible. So they actually try to disincentivize rooftop solar here in El Paso. They put an extra fee, they tack on an extra fee for people that try to have rooftop solar. If you look at other cities around the country like Austin, San Antonio, Los Angeles, that have done amazing strides in transitioning to renewable energy, one thing that a lot of them have in common is that they are a municipal-owned electric utility, right? And that's something that we're also pushing for, not just blocking the sale, but pushing to municipalization, because we see that as the most likely way that we can transition justly if we have a democratic say.
And it's also, Joseph, you mentioned the bankruptcy issue, and this is something it's very much on people's minds right now because of what's happening in California with regards to PG&E, which of course, like, that feels like another very clear-cut example of the trajectory of where this might go.
Exactly. You bring up the PG&E example and how they've had to have forced power outages, and that's another reason for our community to be alarmed. Just in 2016, El Paso Electric had 4 of their natural gas power plants go offline because of the heat wave that we experienced. So if we look at climate change and global warming, El Paso is going to get hotter. The statistics already show that we are close to reaching the record number of days of 100 degrees Fahrenheit or more. And so if we're going to continue having these heat waves, it's going to cause problems with this antiquated technology that we're using in natural gas power plants. And when power goes off, that means schools don't have power, hospitals don't have power, so people are at risk of dying. And you just brought up a perfect example. It's going on right now as we speak with PG&E.
Where are we at in terms of this sale? Is there any legal action taking place, or what kind of tactics are you guys utilizing to fight this?
And so fortunately, there's still hurdles that JPMorgan IIF has to overcome. They have to go through approval with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, otherwise known as FERC, the Public Utility Commission of New Mexico, of Texas, and El Paso City Council. So we've been speaking to various city council members, to our state senator, to our U.S. representative, and just trying to get them involved, because there's these safeguards that are provided to us as a community to make sure that we do our due diligence.
Yeah, and plus we're also trying to take advantage of this attack on our community to organize for a vision that has consumers and the community have more democratic powers.
The technology now is in place. Just 3.5 months ago, Tesla released what's called the Megapack, and that's utility grade battery storage. So, again, being that we're in the city that is the 10th sunniest city in the world, we have this incredible natural resource that we've yet to harness. And so, while the alarm has been sounded in that JP Morgan is trying to purchase our electric utility, as Miguel mentions, this has also provided an opportunity for us to have a seat at the table with our representatives and speak to them about municipalizing, because as long as we stay within the status quo as a publicly traded corporation, we're going to run this risk of losing control of our electric utility in the future.
So I kind of want to shift a little bit here and talk about the crossroads and the intersections, because El Paso is a place that we've covered on the show before as specifically a crossroads of a lot of different issues. And you've touched upon the climate change aspect and the climate chaos aspect with regards to how much El Paso is warming. But I also wanted to talk about how this relates directly to immigration policy.
Yeah, so El Paso is ground zero for climate refugees. We see a lot of refugees coming from Central America, and there is a clear connection between the climate crisis and forced displacement, especially in Central America with all the droughts that are happening, with all of the changes in weather patterns. People that are relying on land to live and to base their economy on agriculture, they're suffering, and they come to El Paso to seek refugees, and our system has failed them in many ways, right? Um, our immigration judges are one of the worst in the country. The United States government does not provide refugees with legal representation. These migrants have to rely on nonprofit organizations to get legal representation. And so, we have to keep in mind that this idea of climate refugees is very important, and it's shockingly not covered as well as it should be in the mainstream media. But as the UN estimates, as many as 250 million climate refugees will be created by the year 2050. And so we see immigration very much tied to the climate crisis. Then there's also the issue of ecofascism, right? Our community was the target of ecofascism in the August 3rd shooting. If you read this shooter's manifesto, it was full of hateful rhetoric, twisted, hateful rhetoric that understood that we're going through an environmental crisis, but reacted in a way that was completely backwards and twisted. And so, as the climate writer Naomi Klein describes the term climate barbarism, we saw climate barbarism happen to our community. So, all the more reason that we should act on the climate crisis. Then there's also the issue of the military-industrial complex. We have a huge military base right in the middle of our city. There is what we call a school-to-bomb making pipeline, where Lockheed Martin has a special program, special deal with our local University of Texas at El Paso, UTEP, where they basically co-opt the careers of STEM students to be part of the military-industrial complex. And it seems like a tangent, but it also relates to the climate crisis because, as your listeners may know, the U.S. military is one of the largest polluters of greenhouse gases in the world. They pollute more than entire countries combined. So we're definitely ground zero for a lot of these issues, and we're trying to organize against that.
Yeah, I mean the as you noted, the military-industrial complex is the largest consumer of fossil fuels in the world. It's equal to 140 countries, and also interestingly enough, with the whole JP Morgan Chase aspect, their investment in fossil fuel projects directly impacts South America and Latin America, because there are a lot of dirty energy projects, a lot of corporate malfeasance with multinational corporations going in and stealing these resources and decimating entire communities in those areas as well. So that's, of course, intricately tied to that aspect as well. So I want to kind of talk about the future, because that's something that you also mentioned. I feel like a lot of the times what happens is that we're always back on our heels with issues, climate chaos, immigration issues. What is Sunrise El Paso looking to build with regards to the future as you're fighting this and other things?
That's a very important point, because we can't just be trying to deal with fires, right? We also have to provide a vision. Basically, we're trying to build a community of advocates for the Green New Deal economy, right? And for example, we're planning an event in January called the El Paso Green New Deal Summit, where we're inviting different activist leaders and social justice organizations to participate, to convene and collaboratively and democratically write how the Green New Deal would apply to our own community, right? And so part of that is this issue of municipalization. Part of that is including immigration rights as part of the Green New Deal. Part of it is recognizing indigenous rights, labor justice, right? So we're trying. It's very easy for us to just be on the defensive, but we also want to more than anything create a community of this consciousness that, you know what, this economy isn't set in stone. We can create something else that's different, that's more responsible, and that tries to mitigate the climate crisis.
For more on Sunrise El Paso, visit sunriseelpaso.org. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Reminder, the best way to stay up to date on our work is to sign up for the newsletter at the address below. To those who have donated, thank you so much. Please keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can't hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left for nothing, motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to